Welcome this morning, now that the sun is shining outside. Our call to worship this morning is from Psalm 1. We'll begin with the first song. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Let's sing God's praises from Psalm 97a. Our scripture reading this morning is from Exodus chapter 20. As I'm looking at Hosea the prophet, it just begs for us to go back to the basics. Exodus chapter 20, beginning in verse 1. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. Bo, can you come lead us in prayer? Well, you don't have to go very far into the book of Hosea in order to realize that this little book in the Old Testament is a most colorful and significant part of our Bible. And a tragedy, as I've been hammering over and over again, is that Christians in our day do not spend much, if any time, studying Hosea and other, what we would consider obscure parts of the Old Testament. And this message and manner of speaking seems foreign to us as a result. But when you read the New Testament carefully, you begin to realize that all the New Testament writers, and even Jesus himself, knew these prophets, including Hosea, backwards and forwards, and they referenced and alluded to them constantly in what they said and did and wrote. In fact, the whole fabric of the New Testament builds on the history and the heritage laid down centuries and even millennia before. Paul and the other apostles constantly built their arguments for Jesus and for the truth of the gospel from the Old Testament and places like Hosea. And that means if you really want to understand the New Testament, then you're going to need first to get a real good handle on the Old Testament. And one of the greatest Bible teachers in church history, at least modern church history, explains the relationship this way. Let me just read you this quote, written back in the 1800s by a Bible scholar named Milton Terry. He explained the situation this way, and I think that this is very relevant to where we are today as a church in America. He says, inasmuch as these two testaments, that's the Old Testament and the New Testament, differ in form, language, and historical conditions, many writers have deemed it preferable to treat the hermeneutics of each testament separately. Hermeneutics is just a study of interpretation. And as the New Testament is the later and fuller revelation, its interpretation has received the fuller and more frequent attention. But it may be questioned whether such a separate treatment of the Old and New Testaments is the better course. It is of the first importance to observe that from a Christian point of view, the Old Testament cannot be fully apprehended without the help of the New. On the other hand, it is equally true that a scientific interpretation of the New Testament is impossible without a thorough knowledge of the older Scriptures. The very language of the New Testament, though belonging to another family of human tongues, is notably Hebraic. The style, diction, and spirit of many parts of the Greek Testament cannot be properly appreciated without acquaintance with the style and the spirit of the Hebrew prophets. In short, the whole Bible is a divinely constructed unity, and there is danger that, in setting one part to the comparative neglect of the other, we may fall into a one-sided and erroneous method of exposition. That was written back in the 1800s, late 1800s, by Milton Terry. And it's, in a sense, if you think about what he said, it's almost prophetic of where the church is today, because we've so overemphasized one part of our Bible to the exclusion of the Old Testament that we end up losing the proper understanding of the New Testament along the way. And so that's why we go back to places like Hosea. We go back to the Old Testament. We go back and study the history and heritage into which Jesus was born, into which he taught his ministry, and into which the apostles carried it on. So the solution is to get back into the story and take a fresh look at places in our Bible like Hosea. Now, as we saw from chapter 1 in Hosea, Hosea is an early prophet that spoke of the coming judgment on the northern kingdom. And he did this in a very unique way. It's a good thing that Hollywood didn't get a hold of our Bible and give ratings, because if that were the case, then our book of Hosea would have a little R circled up on top of your page, because it's very, very graphic and very, very direct. But Hosea is one of those very interesting books, because we have this beginning of a new way of looking at things in Israel in covenant relationship with God. Hosea presents Israel as married to God. And we can go back into the other prophets and piece things together, and it's really presented the idea that Israel was God's girl from her birth, going way back into Genesis. And at Sinai, with the covenant given at Sinai through Moses, there was a marriage that took place, and God married His bride at Sinai. And so now we have, living many, many centuries later, we have the kingdom of Israel split into two after Solomon's reign due to the idolatry of Israel. We have the northern kingdom of the 10 tribes, and we have the southern kingdom of Judah with 2 tribes. And we have a time when God told Hosea to marry an unfaithful woman as a living parable and a message to Israel. Because Israel, by this time, had become unfaithful to God, her husband. God and Israel were married by covenant, yet the 10 tribes, specifically in the context of Hosea, had broken covenant and committed adultery against God by chasing after other gods and by looking for protection and sustenance from the other nations around, rather than relying on God, her husband. That's the situation, the moral, spiritual situation in the northern 10 tribes in the time of Hosea. And Hosea, of course, gave his prophecies over a long period of time, many decades, and they're all assembled for us in his book. So Hosea the prophet married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and they had a child. Their first son, God told to name Jezreel, or actually probably more technically Jezreel, because El is for the name of God, and it actually means God plants. And that name comes from Israel's history related to the story of Naboth's vineyard in the days of wicked King Ahab and Jezebel, and plus all the fallout with King Jehu and his brutality that he instigated after King Ahab and Jezebel. And you can read all about that in the Kings. But that's where the name comes from. Jezreel means God plants, God sows. And so the first son of Hosea and Gomer, God told Hosea to name Jezreel. And as we see these names come out, we should not just think in terms of Israel's history. These are also messages about what God is doing, or how God looks at His children in Israel at this point in time. So there is a message in Jezreel that we should not neglect. It means that God plants or God sows. And that's what God is going to do to Israel. As we read Hosea, we're finding out that God is going to take Israel and sow Israel into the land, into the dirt. Israel is going to die. And that's what Jezreel means. God plants. God's going to plant Israel into the dust of death. Covenant death. Separation from God. And of course, that's what God is working on doing here with His judgment of Israel. And I believe that this is laying some groundwork for the New Testament in interesting ways. Places like 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about the analogy of the seed. I believe he's getting that from places like Hosea, which talks about God Himself planting Israel. And what happens when you plant something? It dies. And then it springs back to life. Resurrection. So this idea of God planting Israel, naming Hosea's first son Jezreel, is laying the foundation here for the New Testament doctrine of resurrection. We're going to get to that connection between Hosea and resurrection as we go through this series, particularly with Paul. It's blatantly obvious and upfront with Paul's teaching on resurrection. So what God plants is going to come back to life in a new way. And we see those promises in Hosea, even in chapter 1. But Israel had to die in order to be raised to new life at the appropriate time. You notice that seeds don't pop up until a certain amount of time goes by. You plant seeds and they lay there for a period of time. There's going to be a period of time in which the northern kingdom is going to be planted in the ground and she's going to be dead. But at the appropriate time, according to the prophecies of Hosea, Israel is going to spring back to life into something new and something living. Well, Gomer had another child, a daughter, and Hosea was told to name her Lo Ruhana, which means not loved. Again, that name is saying something about Israel. Israel, in their unfaithful idolatry, is no longer loved by God. And it could be also no more mercy, because the Hebrew lo ruhama covers both the English meaning for mercy and for love, because in Hebrew they're kind of interchangeable and related. So again, the child's name is a message to Israel. The wickedness of the people had become so great that God's love for His people had grown cold. Not loved, no mercy, is a warning about a judgment to come. Now, Hosea's child is a living picture, a parable for what's going to happen to Israel. And then Gomer had a third child. This one is not even Hosea's child. What was the name of the third child? God told Hosea to name Lo Ami, which means not my people, no kin of mine, not my child. And so this unfaithfulness of Gomer is out in the open, that now Hosea has in his household, in his home, a child that is no longer recognized as his. That's how bad it is getting in Hosea's household. And it's a good demonstration of how God is no longer their father, because they had become children of adultery. The living parable is giving a message to Israel. It's a good example of how lineage in the Bible is primarily covenantal rather than biological. They had broken covenant, and now they are being cast out of the household. They are no longer the children of God. And that's the message of Hosea that we saw in chapter 1, this living parable of Hosea and Gomer, which God set up and arranged for Hosea to engage. It was a reflection of God's marriage to Israel, the northern kingdom. And so let's continue now, picking up in our study in chapter 2, beginning in verse 2. Rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. That is a written certificate of divorce. And we've covered this in the introduction, but this is a bill of divorce delivered to the people by Hosea the prophet, following the law of divorce. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 24, God now declares the indecent thing He has found in his wife. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 24, the only place in God's law which deals with divorce, it lays out the specific guidelines of how a divorce was to take place. First of all, the man was to declare the indecent thing that he finds in his wife. And that's exactly what's going on here in verse 2. He says, let her remove the adulterous look from her face and the unfaithfulness from between her breasts. Otherwise I will strip her naked and make her as bare as on the day she was born. That's the indecent thing in the woman that Hosea, speaking for God, finds. Israel had become an adulterer. And so the bill of divorce is being written, and the law of Deuteronomy 24 states very clearly, once this indecent thing is listed, then you give the woman the bill of divorce, and the very next thing in Deuteronomy chapter 24 is you send her out of the house. That's how divorce, according to the law of Moses, was to work. And divorce in that situation was justified because the covenant was broken. And by sending her out of the house, the parallel to that would be Israel being sent out of the land, the northern kingdom being sent out of the land, away from the presence of God, away from the temple, away from all the order and the covenant system in which they were used to. They were being cut out and sent away. And there's also this idea of stripping her naked and making her as bare as on the day she was born. That goes back to the divorce practices of the ancient Near East. When you had a public divorce in the ancient Near East, the judges and the husband would strip the woman naked, because all the property from the time of that marriage that was given to the woman would be taken back by the husband. Okay? And so she would leave the house without any of the possessions that she received while being in a marriage relationship. And I believe ultimately this is pointing to Israel, what's going to happen to the land. The land is going to be stripped naked, ultimately, and the land is going to be made bare. And it continues in verse 3, I will make her like a desert, turn her into a parched land, and slay her with thirst. I will not show my love to her children, because they are the children of adultery. Their mother has been unfaithful and has conceived them in disgrace. She said, I will go after my lovers who give me my food and my water, my wool and my linen, my oil and my drink. Therefore, I will block her path with thorn bushes. I will wall her in so that she cannot find her way. She will chase after her lovers, but not catch them. She will look for them, but not find them. Then she will say, I will go back to my husband as at first, for then I was better off than now. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil, who lavished on her the silver and the gold which they used for Baal. The picture is that God had lavished His wife with every good thing in the land. All the good things of life God blessed Israel with, and yet Israel did not acknowledge the source. Worse yet, Israel took the good gifts from God and used them to honor false gods. Israel used the silver and the gold that God blessed her with in order to make idols and to worship false gods and the Baals. And yet we understand from the law that God does not share His glory with false gods. He is a jealous husband according to the household rule number 1. Right? Household rule number 1, you shall have no other gods before me. And literally in Hebrew it's, you shall have no other gods in my sight that I can see. You shall have no other gods before me. That's the household rule from the Mosaic covenant number 1. So as part of the divorce, God intends to show Israel the true source of all the good things she had enjoyed while living in God's house. Continue in verse 9. Therefore, I will take away my grain when it ripens, and my new wine when it is ready. I will take back my wool and my linen, intended to cover her nakedness. So now I will expose her lewdness before the eyes of her lovers. No one will take her out of my hands. I will stop all her celebrations, her yearly festivals, her new moons, her Sabbath days, all her appointed feasts. I will ruin her vines and her fig trees, which she said were her pay from her lovers. I will make them a thicket, and wild animals will devour them. I will punish her for the day she burned incense to the Baals. She decked herself with rings and jewelry and went after her lovers, but me she forgot. Lots and lots and lots in that passage. Israel is going to drink the cup of judgment following the pattern of the law of divorce in Deuteronomy 24. God is going to send Israel out of His house naked and possessionless in order to show her where all of her good things came from. This idea that the Sabbath days are going to come to an end, it is interesting in Hebrew that it's literally the Sabbath days are going to come to an end, bringing about the end of rest. And of course, once you pull away the Sabbath day in the system of the worship of the Old Testament, you could no longer engage in all the other festivals either, because everything was based off of the new moon and the Sabbath day observance. So God is going to bring an end to her whole worship system by bringing an end to her new moons and her Sabbath days. Everything else is going to collapse as a result of God bringing an end or putting to rest the Sabbath. Interesting play in words in Hebrew. The imagery here is based ultimately on the story of the garden in Genesis. Like Adam and Eve, Israel enjoyed a garden while living in God's house. Vine and fig trees are the images of stability and prosperity in the ancient world. Every man under his vine and fig tree, right? That's what the prophets foresaw. What are they foreseeing? They're foreseeing the blessings of the new covenant. Rest, prosperity, security, stability. And yet God says He will send Israel from that blessed condition into a wilderness with thorn bushes to block her way. Notice the mention of thorn bushes. Verse 6. Therefore I will block her path with thorn bushes. This is a variation and expansion of the story of the Garden of Eden. Because Adam and Eve, when they broke covenant also, they were sent out into the wilderness and to deal with thorns and wild animals. So Israel was to be sent out from the land or garden of rest into the wilderness where wild animals roam and destroy. And so here comes Assyria, then Babylon, Egypt and Greece devouring Israel as she is in her diaspora, in the exile. Rome. All these wild animals abounded outside of God's garden, outside of God's protection, the wall of protection in His land. And so God's judgment of Israel had been pronounced, the certificate of divorce had been delivered, and Israel was to be sent out of God's house. But notice that the prophet's message doesn't end there. Picking up in verse 14. And this is one of those reversals I talked about, how the prophet begins in judgment and then reverses himself and makes a wholly different proclamation. Verse 14, therefore, I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the desert and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her back her vineyards and will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. There she will sing as in the days of her youth, as in the day she came up out of Egypt. What's the imagery that the prophet's using? He's reaching back and he's grabbing the days of the Exodus, coming out of Egypt, and he says that their vineyards are going to be given back to them while they are still in the wilderness. The prophet's talking about a new exile here. There's going to be another exile of God's people that the prophet foresees. And while they are in the desert, still in exile, God is going to go to them and speak tenderly to them and woo them back to Himself. And there, that is, in the wilderness, she will sing as in the days of her youth, as in the day she came up out of Egypt. Now you understand why the New Testament is filled with that imagery of the Exodus theme, of continuing on. Paul talked about continuing on and not falling into unfaithfulness like they did in the wilderness, as their bodies fell in the wilderness, as they lacked faith. Verse 16, in that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. You will no longer call me my master. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked. In that day, I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the creatures that move along the ground. This is a promise of restoration to the people. The covenant relationship between God and His people would be restored. And at that time, there's a time statement, at that time, God will remove the vain idols and cause Israel to live once again in faithful union and communion with God as husband and wife. No longer as master and servant, as husband and wife. Verse 18, the prophet continues with more proclamations. In that day I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the creatures that move along the ground. Bow and sword I will abolish from the land, so that all may lie down in safety. Where's that language come from? The beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the creatures that move along the ground. Where does that come from ultimately in the Bible? Genesis, creation. God's going to make a new covenant with creation. And that tells you a lot about what Genesis is all about. Because in this case, God's going to make a new covenant not only with Israel, but with all the other nations around Israel too, those animals that Israel was to be husband of. Remember the story of Adam? Adam was to lead the creation into the knowledge of God. Adam was supposed to spread the knowledge of God with all the birds and the animals and the creatures and the creeping things. And also we see this story happening over and over again. Whenever God saves Israel, He always saves what? The animals around them too. When Noah went in the ark, what did he take? He took the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, and the creeping things. Right? And so the prophet's looking forward to a new creation here, a new covenant, because covenant and creation are related. But guess what's missing? What's missing in this from Genesis creation chapter 1? You see something missing here? Let me compare it to another passage in Hosea 4. Notice Hosea 4, verse 3. This is a judgment on Israel's failed mission in the Old Testament. Verse 3 of chapter 4, because of this the land mourns and all who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the fish of the sea are dying. Do you see something different there? What's missing in the first one? In the proclamation of a new covenant with all of creation, there is no mention of fish. Why is that? Because in the new heavens and new earth, there is no more sea. He's looking forward to the new creation, a new heavens and earth, a new covenant arrangement. So He leaves, interestingly enough, He leaves the sea out of that. No fish mentioned. Although Israel was being judged for allowing the fish of the sea to die. They were not taking care of the Gentile nations. They were not caretaking God's creation and leading all the other nations into the knowledge of God. That was their failure. So this is creation language and the story of the new creation being foreseen by Hosea. Verse 19, I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice and in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. This is amazing. After all the bad things that Hosea had to say about Israel, we now have a reversal. Israel, God's adulterous wife, will be betrothed to God. What does the prophet foresee? He foresees a remarriage, a new marriage. And I want to note once again, like I did earlier in the series, of how these prophecies of Hosea create major problems for modern theologies that we are so familiar with. There are many Christians who believe that this prophecy remains to be fulfilled in the future with national Israel. And this approach, if you hear about Christians talking about Israel, still God's chosen people, being the nation place of Israel over in the Middle East, it's based on a strong distinction between God's church and Israel, but the New Testament speaks of the church as the bride of Christ. If you think about that, we have a little bit of a problem. Because if you make a big distinction between Israel and the church, what does that say about what God does with marriage? He's betrothed to the church through Christ, and He's going to get married again to a different woman? That's what modern Christian theology, particularly dispensational futurism, teaches. God is a polygamist. He's going to fulfill this prophecy at some time in our future, in which, although He's betrothed to the church now, He's going to betroth again to national Israel, because Israel and the church are distinct. And that says that God is a polygamist. It's a very bad error, I believe. It's entirely wrong, based on a misunderstanding of the Old Testament and the New Testament at the same time. Dispensationalism is a polygamous view of God, for God is a covenant relationship to multiple women at the same time. Others don't agree with dispensationalism, but they still suggest that the church replaces Israel in the New Testament. And the problem with that view is that it means that this prophecy of God betrothing Himself to Israel forever fails. In other words, they'll say that Israel is of the Old Testament and they go away, and the church replaces Israel. And that creates major problems too, because then you have this prophecy given to Israel never coming to pass. It fails. It fails because God gives up on Israel and moves on to marry another, the church, and that, of course, makes Hosea a false prophet. That theology makes Hosea a false prophet, which again is based on a distinction between Israel and the church. And in our background with Reformed tradition, it is very common that they say that Israel as a nation will convert to Christ in the end times, based on a futurist view of places like Romans 11. So God was married to Israel in the Old Covenant, then is betrothed to the church through Christ, and then in the end times when national Israel converts, she comes back into covenant relationship with God as well. And so God goes from one woman to the next, and then back to the first woman, as a futurist view of Romans chapter 11 would say. Of course, the implications are horrific in light of the law of divorce in Deuteronomy chapter 24. The law forbid a man from taking a woman to be married, divorcing her, being married again, and then going back to the first woman. That would defile the land of Israel. Well, the solution here is very simple. How do we make sense of what Hosea is talking about in his prophecy? Israel is the church, and the church is Israel. No distinction. And so, though God planted Israel in judgment, Jezreel, He raised Israel by raising the church in Jesus Christ. And God's betrothal to the church is His betrothal to true Israel at the appointed time. And so God is a one-woman God. That's the proper way of handling this. Hosea the prophet is foreseeing the salvation of the church, which is the Israel of God, to use Paul's language. Verse 21, In that day I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the skies, or to the heavens, and they will respond to the earth, and the earth will respond to the grain, the new wine and oil, and they will respond to Jezreel, God plants. I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people, and they will say, you are my God. Restoration, reunification, remarriage. That's what the prophet's talking about. But does that look familiar to you? Turn with me to 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2. Where do you think Peter got this idea from? 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 9, Peter writes to the church, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation." Sound like Israel? Same language. "A people belonging to God." Sounds like Israel to me. "That you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His wonderful light." Isn't that the story of Israel? Out of darkness into the light? "Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." And so Peter goes back to Hosea and teaches them that they are now the fulfillment of Hosea's prophecy. The body of Christ, the church, is bringing about the fulfillment of Hosea. Jesus is the new Israel, the Israel of old being made new in Christ. The church is being gathered together into a new temple, a new dwelling place of God, and that's the imagery here in 1 Peter 2 about a new temple being built. "Once you were not a people, lo Ami. Once you had not received mercy, lo Ruhana." So the church, the bride of Christ, is the Israel of God, betrothed to God forever and ever. And that's you and me. We are the true Israel. We are married to God. And that's one of the greatest lessons about Hosea and how it gives you a mindset about what it means to be God's people. What it means to be God's people is to be married to God. We are all married to God as His church. This is one of the greatest lessons that the story and imagery of Hosea teaches. We are God's beloved spouse as we live in the church. We are not single. We are not unattached. We are not waiting around for our wedding at the end of the world. The wedding was the new covenant. And we live in the new covenant. If the new covenant has arrived and we live in the new covenant, then the new marriage has arrived as well. That's what Hosea teaches us. Covenant and marriage go together. So prepare yourself as God's wife in Jesus Christ for faithfulness to your husband. May we all live blessed lives in God's house forever as we seek to fulfill the mission and the role of Israel of old. Let's pray.